Okay. Okay, so welcome to all of you in our lunchtime webinar series, first part. My name is Barbara Mihok, and I'm working for the Environmental Social Science Research Group. And we are now organizing or presenting 3 webinars in a row this week about stakeholder and citizen engagement. And from the, we are representing here the Forwards project. Just a little bit of background about this project. With 11 countries and 19 partners, this project aims to support climate smart forestry in Europe. With providing spatially explicit projections and regionalized roadmaps supporting management and planning decisions. And the ultimate output of this project would be the Forest World Observatory, which is designed to be useful for policy makers and managers and forestry practitioners regarding climate smart forestry. In the context, the framework of the Forwards project, now there is grant schemes published for third parties. You can find more information about this on our website. And these grant schemes are for the third parties. Recently opened the citizen and stakeholder engagement grant schemes. And we plan this webinar series to be a support for the applicants for these grant schemes to provide useful and easy to use tools for stakeholder engagement and activities and planning. So these webinars hopefully provide you with this information and support. And the first webinar today will be about an overview of the stakeholder engagement strategy in Forwards, the concepts and context. So you might find it useful for your overall activities. The structure of the webinars goes like there will be 2 presentations in the beginning of the webinars, and then there will be a question and answer section. You can also submit your questions via the chat. And we are recording these webinars. They will be uploaded on the website, and I will also send you the slideshow in PDF during this meeting, so you will have it the hand-on for the presentations. Okay, I think I said everything. So if you would like to contact us for further information, I included our contacts in the chat. So feel free to write us or with any questions. And then if there is no question from you so far, everything is clear, then I would like to give the floor to Esther Kelemen, who will talk about the next topic. Okay.
Thank you, and also a warm welcome on my behalf. My name is Esther Kelemen. I'm also working at the Environmental Social Science Research Group in Hungary. And I was part of the team who drafted the Forwards Engagement Strategy, which is used by the project partners. And basically this engagement strategy serves as the main background of this webinar series, because we thought that probably other practitioners who are not members of the project consortium but interested in climate smart forestry or forest restoration and work together with stakeholders would be interested to learn some of the tools and techniques we apply in this project, And as Barbara said, we believe that this might be particularly useful if you plan to apply for one of the grants of forwards. At the end of the presentation, we will also include or share a link with you where the engagement strategy is available online. So everything which we explain here is basically also available in a written format, and you will have an access to that. And we can go to the next slide. First of all, the question might arise, why do we need an engagement, a stakeholder or citizen engagement if we work with forest management? And the literature is quite provides quite plentiful evidence that if stakeholders and citizens are engaged in a forest-related project, which could be either a research project or a management-focused or restoration-focused project, this engagement can improve the knowledge base of the project, so engagement can lead to better informed decisions. Also within our own professional experience, we met situations several times where there were some kind of hidden conflicts in a locality, and the engagement process itself can bring these conflicts up to the surface, and that also provides opportunities to resolve or manage these conflicts. And also stakeholder engagement can go hand in hand with social learning, so that the different stakeholders who are engaged in the process can learn from each other, they can change their attitudes, they can change their behavior. So at the end, it is not just the project objective which can be achieved easier, but perhaps it is possible to reach wider ranging impacts, and the results might be more legitimate, useful, and perhaps also easier to implement if there is a kind of consensus in the main objectives or the main findings of the project. If we go to the next slide. You see here three main concepts which we use in the forward stakeholder engagement strategy. Basically, the first one, of course, is the stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders? In the scientific literature, the word stakeholders come from the business literature actually, but it gets more and more popular in projects related to nature conservation and also to forest management. And stakeholders refer to all those actors who can influence or who are impacted by decisions related to nature, or in this case, decisions related to forest management. So without a full list, a stakeholder can be a municipality, an NGO, a conservation actor. A stakeholder can be a land user, not just a forest manager, but also nearby farmers or owners of land. And also stakeholders can be visitors of the forest, tourists, local inhabitants. So this is quite a broad range of different actors who might be the stakeholders of a forest management activity, depending on whether they have an influence or suffer from or enjoy the impacts of an activity. Citizens are considered as special stakeholders. This group can include local communities who live in or nearby forests or who enjoy the ecosystem services provided by the forest, but who are not in a decision-making position when it comes to decisions on forest management. So from this point of view, we can consider citizens as specific stakeholders who are impacted by forest management activities, but who have less impact on what is actually done. And when we speak about the engagement of stakeholders and citizens, we refer to diverse approaches through which these different actors can get access to the process of making a decision or collecting scientific data or analyzing different aspects of forest management. And engagement, as already mentioned in the previous slide, is considered as a process of not just exchanging information, but also as building relationships and co-creating outputs, either research outputs or management outputs. We can go to the next slide. In this very simplistic figure, you can see different types of engagement. In the easiest way, when we communicate with our stakeholders about a project, when we share information with them, we are already reaching out and making some initial steps of stakeholder engagement. However, if we stay at this informed level, this includes only a one-way information flow. But we can move towards the more complex approaches to stakeholder engagement. For instance, if we think about consultation with stakeholders, that means a different type of information flow. When we ask specific questions, we ask for specific input from our stakeholders to the decision-making process of the project we are running. This could be, for instance, interviews, surveys, public hearings, when we have, for instance, a debated issue to make a decision, and we are interested in what our stakeholders think about that. An even more profound way of involving our stakeholders is the involvement phase, where there is a mutual interaction. We are sharing information on our decision-making process, on our project or data collection, and we are also asking input. This already means some kind of joint learning process because we are truly exchanging information. We are not just sharing, we are not just asking, but we are progressing towards a common goal. And the most profound way of engaging stakeholders can be the collaboration, when the whole research or the whole management process is co-designed by the stakeholders and those who are taking the responsibility of coordinating the process. I have a scientific background, I'm a researcher, so it's the easiest for me is to speak about stakeholder engagement in research. So if I'm thinking of stakeholder engagement in research, then the collaboration phase means that we involve stakeholders from the very beginning when we decide what is the research question, what we would like to answer. So this is the collaboration phase. And at the very end of the figure, you see the empowerment category. In some categorization, this is already beyond stakeholder engagement, but we included it here because in this very last stage, the power hierarchy is changed. So it is actually it's the stakeholders who are empowered to take decisions in the process. Just to sum up the different stages or the spectrum of the stakeholder engagement, we can see that there might be different stakeholders, and for different stakeholders, you might want to use different types of engagement. So it might be that for some stakeholders it is enough to inform them or consult them, and there is one crucial stakeholder group whom you would like to collaborate with. So it's fine if you are not doing the same level of stakeholder with everyone, and it is also fine if at different stages of your project you are doing different types of engagement. For instance, when you are planning your project, it might be enough to consult your stakeholders, to sense their most important, most relevant questions you would like to incorporate in your project. Then when you are already in the project phase, you might select a couple of key stakeholders for involvement or collaboration, and at the end of the project, you might try to engage a much broader audience by informing them. So it's also it might also happen that in different phases of your project, you refer to different types of engagement. And if we go to the next slide, we listed here a couple of principles which are important to consider when you plan a stakeholder engagement process or a project where you also include your stakeholders. First of all, it's for a regular project as well, but especially if you engage stakeholders and citizens, it is very important to have clear objectives and also communicate these objectives to your stakeholders. Otherwise, it won't be clear for them why to engage in the process and what they can benefit from this engagement. Another critical point is to invite relevant stakeholders, and by relevant, it is always useful to think about maybe stakeholder groups who are a little bit marginalized or maybe not coming to your mind at the first place, but who either can have a very strong influence on the success of your project or might be very strongly influenced by your project. And the second presentation today, Claire, will talk a little bit more about who are the relevant stakeholders. The third principle is to invite stakeholders as early as possible. So in some cases, it is already at the phase when you set up the objectives of your project. Sometimes you have a much more, a longer, maybe you have a long-term restoration process where stakeholders are changing across time. So at that case, it is not possible to engage from the very beginning, but still, if you plan, for instance, a new activity, then it is always good to let them know as early as possible. Then this is a little bit similar or in relationship to the first principle, having a clear objective. It is also very important for the stakeholders to let them know what they can benefit from getting engaged in your project. What is the impact they can have on your project, on your objectives, on your outputs. Because if this is not clear for them, they might not have necessarily the motivation to meaningfully participate in the process. The fifth objective is to make your participants competent in participating in your project. This means that, for instance, if we speak again about a research project, this might mean that you provide them some kind of scientific information, some kind of background knowledge, which they can use to be an active participant in your project, but which they can also gain for their later professional or personal life. But it might be also just very easily, if we consider a restoration project, making your participants competent might mean that you share hands-on experience or like tangible things like how to do a certain activity if they are in the forest, or how to collect some kind of data if you are there together. It is very important to always have an eye on the whole process, not just on the outputs of engagement, because as I said previously, engagement is about building trust. And sometimes it might happen that the process is more important than the outcomes, referring to the fact that sometimes making a decision, even if it takes a little bit longer, you might earn more if you make this decision in a trustful and legitimate way and a transparent way, because conflicts might be minimized. And that's why the process is so important to think about. We believe that applying facilitators is a very useful thing to do. Sometimes it's not possible because of lack of resources or lack of experience, but many times having a a third party who is external to your organization can help, especially if there is a conflictuous situation with your stakeholders. And then the last principle is, again, paying attention to make engagement as comfortable as possible. Tomorrow we will share a couple of good examples from our earlier work. And there you will see that, for instance, in a previous work, we organized a one-day workshop where we also had a very decent lunch, so that really think about what can make your stakeholders comfortable, what can make them open, what is the atmosphere where they will feel safe and happy to discuss things, even things which can be a little bit sensitive to them. So yeah, small things, but sometimes very important. And I think this is my last slide today. This is a couple of practical steps, process-wise, how we usually approach the organization of a stakeholder engagement activity. First, we formulate our objectives, set the aim and the purpose of the engagement process, and communicate it to our main stakeholders as well as to the facilitators if we invite facilitators to the process. Then we also analyze our stakeholders to be sure that we are not missing anyone who is important. And you see stakeholder analysis with bold letters because the next presentation will go into details of stakeholder analysis. The stakeholder analysis is crucial to be able to choose the right tool for the engagement. And the third webinar in this series will be about the tools of engagement. Then basically the watch out phase is about really planning the nitty-gritty details of the engagement process, including the timing, the resources, the basic conditions. Then we are applying the selected tools and engaging our stakeholders. And lastly, the two last steps. Sometimes we believe that when we are done with our engagement activity, the workshop is over, etc., we feel that it's over, but actually it's not over, because it is always useful to evaluate the process, get feedback from your participants, what they liked, what they didn't like, and then disseminate the results, share what you have learned from your stakeholders with the stakeholders who participated. And I think that's it from my side for today. Oh yeah, that should be deleted, sorry.
Thank you, Esther. Claire, the floor is yours now.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Esther. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Do tell me if you cannot. Okay.
Yes.
So yes, thank you. I'm going to talk about stakeholder mapping and analysis. So I'm Claire Hall. I work at Forest Research. We're part of we're a research agency of the UK government. We work across Great Britain, so not Northern Ireland. And I'm actually based in Scotland. And I'm obviously part of the Forwards project. So next slide, please, Barbara. So one of the principles of stakeholder engagement that Esther just mentioned to you in her slides was the idea that you should include or invite every relevant stakeholder. So to my mind, this raises two questions, perhaps. First of all, how do you identify who your stakeholders are? So that we would refer to as a process of stakeholder mapping. And secondly, how do you identify or how do you decide who are the most or the more relevant stakeholders to be included in your engagement? And that would be a process of stakeholder analysis. So I'm going to try to provide a few answers to these two questions using the example of what we've already done within the Forwards project to identify our own stakeholders relevant to this project. Next slide, please, Barbara. So the first part of the process that we did, or in fact other colleagues of mine or other colleagues within the project did, was to think about the different types of stakeholders or the different stakeholder groups. So we aimed to design a stakeholder map template in Excel that we would then be providing to our work package colleagues and our demonstration site colleagues within the Forwards project. And we wanted to send to them this list of different types of stakeholder groups and some examples of subgroups within the high level stakeholder groups that might apply in their own case. So not all of these stakeholder groups will be relevant in all cases, but we tried to be as comprehensive as we could be when drawing up this list, as I say, of potential stakeholder groups. So you might want to think about questions like who has an interest in what happens in your forest, who has an influence on what happens in your forest, and in terms of what happens in your forest, who is important, or who is that important to? Who accesses or uses your forest, and who is impacted by activities or events that happen within the forest? So I think probably initially when people are trying to think of their stakeholders relevant to their own forest, they might think, well, of course, the landowners and the forest managers is the most obvious example that springs to mind immediately. And of course, within that, though, you might have potentially quite a complicated combination of landowners, depending on the size of the forested area that you're focusing on. So there could be public landowners, of course, it might be private. There may be third sector or charitable landowners, or possibly community group ownership. Certainly that happens in Scotland quite a lot now. And of course, the managers of the forest areas might not, in fact, be the same as the owners. In some cases it will be, some cases it won't be. So these are all of the types of stakeholders and subgroups that you might want to start thinking about. But of course, beyond that, you then might want to think about, well, actually, where does the money come from for the activities within the forest to take place? Is it simply that it's the private owners and their business investment, or are they also receiving grants through some sort of government agency? Are there other donors involved? Are there charities or community groups or other interests that actually provide some of the funding for what happens within the area? All of these might be considered relevant stakeholders that you want to map. And then, of course, there's likely to be a lot of economic activity within the forest, or potentially. Maybe it's purely timber production, but in many cases, of course, with a lot of European forests, it's very much multi-purpose, multi-activity, many different interests in what is happening in any particular forested area. Certainly the demonstration site that's based here in Scotland, there's a lot of local business interest in terms of tourism and recreation, but it is ultimately the publicly owned forested area where timber production is also very important. But there are certainly other economic actors who are relevant stakeholders in this particular case, and that may well apply in other forests across Europe. And as we get further down this list of stakeholder groups, possibly environmental organisations, think about different interest groups who may not have any influence perhaps on the decisions and the activities. They may not do any management, but they're likely to be interested potentially, if they're a nature conservation organisation or an environmental charity, could well be considered a stakeholder in your forest as well. And so on down through education and research. Obviously, we're very focused on that ourselves because we're all researchers. The university sector, are they doing projects? Are they doing surveillance or monitoring? Are they providing information that's relevant to forest managers within the area? So again, potentially a relevant stakeholder group. And also, don't forget the communities and the people who live locally, or the visitors to the area. They may be accessing it for recreation or activities of their own, or it may simply be that it's their local landscape, it's their local environment. So they are in some way impacted potentially by things that happen within the forest, by decisions that are made. So all of these, as I say, are potentially relevant stakeholders that you need to think about and map. And then we have media. So there might not be an obvious stakeholder that springs to mind, but think about maybe they're doing articles about what's happening in the area. Maybe they're helping promote activities. So again, all potentially relevant stakeholders. And then of course, everybody operates within a regulatory framework. So there'll be authorities that are overseeing, so planning, economic development, tourism, environmental management, and so on, all of which will potentially be relevant stakeholders. So these were the categories that we came up with, as I say, for the Forwards project in terms of potentially relevant stakeholder groups. May not apply everywhere, clearly, in every case, but worth considering. Next slide, please, Barbara. So we entered, as I say, all of those stakeholder categories and the subcategories into our template in Excel. And then we sent that template to our work package colleagues in the project and our demonstration site colleagues in the project and asked them to think through all of those stakeholder groups, plus any others that we might have missed that were relevant to them, and tell us things like what organization is relevant in their particular case, information about job titles, if there were specific roles and jobs within that organization. We also asked for information about their main roles and responsibilities relevant to that particular organization. We didn't ask for personal details for data protection reasons. And then, so I will talk about level of interest in climate smart forestry, forest restoration, and decision-making and level of influence on actions. We'll talk about that in a little while with a couple of other slides, because that's our stakeholder analysis part. So yes, I'll come back to that. And then we also asked for things like alliances. So another part of the stakeholder analysis that we carried out, which actually I'm not going to talk about today for time reasons, but clearly, if you draw up a list of your stakeholders, they don't exist, you know, sort of independent of each other. In many cases, they interact, they have to communicate, they have to work together potentially. So we asked for a bit of guidance on, you know, the main collaborators of each of these stakeholders, or the kind of key connections between stakeholders and organizations, which can be an important part of stakeholder analysis. And then we also collected information, publicly available information for each of the stakeholders regarding, you know, web address and social media contacts and so on. Next slide, please, Barbara. So yes, I've included one example. This is specifically from the Italian demonstration site in Forwards. Thank you. So the Italian colleague sent us the details of 18 stakeholders. I should say for some of the other parts of the project, we received or we were able to gather much larger lists of stakeholders in some cases. So, you know, it can be up to 80, 85 individual stakeholder organizations that were included. But I want to talk through the Italian one. It says slightly fewer stakeholders that they specified, but it covered quite a range of our high-level stakeholder groups. So they'd thought through the different groups that we'd provided in the template. And if we look really at the right-hand column is the one of interest here, because that's the information that the Italian colleagues sent to us. And I haven't named organizations. I've simply put the type of organization here, but covers a specific region. So there's one regional government in terms of public landowner, and the 7 municipality governments sitting beneath the regional government. Public landowners, community forest managers, the specific forest contractors who are actually doing the work. So again, those kind of obvious stakeholders that we might all immediately think of. But other stakeholders they were able to name as well, covering you know, ecotourism business, a tourism association in the area that covered obviously the range of recreational and tourism businesses active in the area. Quite a focus on the kind of university research educational side was very relevant for their area as well as a community group, you know, a sort of a membership activity group, local club that you can join for mountain biking and so on. And then, yes, the regional administration overseeing forest planning, or putting the forest plan, I should say, in place. So as I say, they kind of thought about these groups stakeholder groups and come up with this particular list on their map. Next slide, please, Barbara. As I say, we collected information about their roles and responsibilities as well. So again, the right-hand column just explains the information that the project partners sent to us about their stakeholders. And again, so I say this just helps to think through who might be relevant stakeholders in your own particular interested area, because it covers, yes, forest management, it covers planning, it covers the kind of monitoring and control of forests. It also looks at, if it's timber harvesting going on, maybe nature conservation, environmental conservation, as I say, the tourism and recreation side of things, and so on down through the local community activities as well. Next slide, please. So moving on to stakeholder analysis. So that was the process of really stakeholder mapping, thinking who are your stakeholders, but how do we decide who are those relevant ones that you really do want to engage in your stakeholder engagement process? So one of the kind of commonly used approaches to this is to look at interest influence. So to really try to understand who has a higher level of interest in our case, it was a level of interest in climate smart forestry within the area, or forest restoration, but also who has the most power or influence in terms of decision making and actions, so things that are actually happening. Again, in our case, with regard to climate smart forestry and forest restoration. And the reason this is potentially a useful tool is because if we look at that matrix, which basically maps that level of interest against the level of influence, you might want to focus your resources on the top right-hand quadrant there, which is those stakeholders who have both a high level of interest in your forest or in your topic, but also have a high level of influence on what actually is happening in that area. And that's not to say you ignore the other stakeholders. That's fine, Barbara, thanks. Yeah, it's not to say you ignore the others, but just perhaps it helps understand where you need to focus your resources for stakeholder engagement. So this is just the example again from the Italy part of our project, the Italian demonstration site, and we can see that the people or the stakeholders that they had specified have a high level of interest and a high level of influence, are those in the top right again. So it is the public landowners, but it's also the other managers, so the community managers, the private managers, the education and research, so the university and the Forest Research Institute, but also the planning authority. And then, yes, there are other stakeholders who are obviously in different parts of the matrix. As I say, you might not want to exclude the other stakeholders completely, but if we think back to Esther's spectrum of engagement, you can think who you might want to have towards the kind of the right-hand end of that engagement, who are most heavily involved, who you spend your most time engaging with, and those who you perhaps just want to inform about what is going on. So they're likely to be in the bottom left part of your quadrant there. So that's, I think I've got one more slide just to kind of conclude, just to repeat really some of the key points of what I've been saying in terms of stakeholder engagement and mapping. So when mapping, think about what categories of stakeholder are relevant to your forest or your particular topic or interest or project. And don't forget that could be private businesses and organizations, public bodies, third sector communities, other interest groups, individuals who live locally or visit, but also think of different scales. So we've got local, regional, national, maybe even international, European. What information do you need to know about them? We obviously collected quite a bit of information in our stakeholder map, but you might not want all of that information. And then in terms of analysis, again, it comes back to that level of interest and influence that I've just been trying to talk about. So hopefully in the next 2 webinars, if you're able to join for the next 2 lunch times, once you've identified your stakeholders, we can then learn more about how you might actually go about engaging them in terms of tools and methods to use. So I hope that's been useful. Thank you, Barbara.